The smoke rising from the cabin chimney was the cruelest thing about that evening. Eleanor Hartwell had been sitting on the roof of the woodshed for nearly an hour, watching that smoke curl upward into the iron-gray Idaho sky, thinking about how a thing could look exactly like home and feel like a stranger's house at the same time. The woodshed roof was the one place on the property where Clarence never came. She had discovered this by accident in August, 3 weeks after he moved in, and she had been using it ever since as the last square footage on Earth that still belonged to her in any meaningful way. Inside, through the frost haze window of the main room, she could see the amber flicker of the fireplace. Her father's fireplace. Her father's chair, the one with the cracked leather armrest that Thomas Hartwell had repaired twice with strips of saddle leather, sat facing the fire. Clarence was in it now as he had been every evening for 8 months, his boots up on the footstool her father had built from a single piece of ponderosa pine the winter Eleanor turned 9. The whiskey he was drinking had been purchased by Thomas Hartwell in the spring of 1881. Thomas had set it on the highest shelf in the kitchen and told Eleanor it was for a day worth celebrating. She had asked him which day that would be. He had smiled and said he would know it when it came. Clarence had opened it on his third night in the house. Today was November 14th, 1886, Eleanor's 16th birthday. She had been awake since before dawn, not from excitement, but from the habit of early rising that her father had drilled into her since she was small enough to be carried on his shoulders through the morning frost to check the water lines. There was no cake. There was no gift. Clarence had eaten the larger share of the morning oatmeal without acknowledging what day it was, and Eleanor had spent the remainder of the daylight hours making herself invisible. She reached into the pocket of her wool coat and closed her fingers around the small compass her father had given her when she turned 12. It was a beautiful instrument, a brass-cased surveyor's compass with a beveled crystal face and a needle that still held true after years of mountain use. Thomas had shown her how to triangulate her position using 2 fixed landmarks, how to account for magnetic declination in this part of Idaho, and how to walk a straight bearing through dense timber without losing her heading. He had made her practice until she could navigate by compass in the dark. She was thinking about this when she noticed the horse. Clarence's bay gelding, a heavy-footed animal that Clarence rode hard and cared for poorly, was standing at the rear gate of the property, not in the paddock where it belonged, at the gate, saddled. The stirrups had been run up the leathers the way a man prepares a horse for standing in cold weather rather than immediate riding, but the bedroll was strapped to the back of the saddle and the saddlebags were loaded full. Eleanor looked at that horse for a long time. Clarence had not mentioned a trip. He had not packed in her presence. He had spent the entire day sitting in the house eating her father's food, drinking her father's whiskey. And yet sometime between morning and now, he had saddled his horse and loaded it with provisions. The horse had been ready since this morning. The cold settled into her bones with a new quality then. Not the ordinary cold of a November evening at elevation, but something sharper. Something that had nothing to do with temperature. She climbed down from the woodshed roof. The kitchen was warm when she came inside, heated by the cook stove that she had fed on all day to keep the pipes from freezing. She moved to the basin and washed her hands. She listened to the fire in the main room, to the slow creak of her father's chair, to the particular silence of a man who knows something and is waiting for the right moment. She found the document by accident. She had gone to the narrow oak desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one where Thomas had kept his survey maps and land records, to retrieve a pencil. The top drawer was slightly open. She saw the edge of a paper inside bearing the official seal of the Territorial Court of Idaho, and she pulled the drawer the rest of the way open without fully deciding to. The document was 3 pages long. She read it standing at the kitchen desk with her wet hands leaving damp prints on the edges of the paper. It was a petition to the court requesting the formal transfer of all property rights, land title, and financial assets belonging to the estate of Thomas Hartwell, deceased, into the name of Clarence Hartwell, on the grounds that the sole surviving heir, Eleanor Hartwell, was a minor female incapable of managing her father's estate and in need of legal guardianship until her 21st year. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in a careful official hand, was the signature of Sheriff Denton Crow, serving as witness and co-petitioner. The petition had been filed 6 weeks ago. She had been living in this house with Clarence for 6 weeks after he had already moved in court to take everything her father had built. Eleanor set the papers down on the desk very carefully, the way she had learned to set things down when her hands were shaking and she did not want anyone to hear. She walked into the main room. Clarence did not look up when she entered. He was reading a newspaper by firelight, one leg crossed over the other, her father's whiskey glass balanced on the arm of her father's chair. He was a big man, not tall but wide through the shoulders, with a red complexion that deepened toward purple when he drank, and a way of occupying space that always made every room feel smaller. He was 44 years old. He had her father's jaw and her father's dark eyes, and every time Eleanor looked at him, she had to work to keep the two faces from blurring together in her mind. She told him she had found the petition. He turned a page of the newspaper. She asked him about the life insurance policy. She had seen it before, a document bearing the name of the Fidelity and Merchants Life Assurance Company of Chicago, which Thomas had taken out the year Eleanor was born. She had found it once by accident as a child, and her father had explained it to her simply. It was a promise that if something happened to him, she would be taken care of. Clarence folded the newspaper in half and set it on his knee. He looked at her, then really looked at her with an expression she had never quite been able to name. It was not cruelty exactly, or not only cruelty. It was the expression of a man who has been playing a long game and has finally arrived at the move he planned. He reached into the breast pocket of his vest and produced a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it and held it toward her without standing. It was the transfer petition, not the copy she had found in the desk, the filed original bearing the court clerk's stamp. "This is a legal document," he said. His voice was even unhurried. "I am your guardian of record. The land is under my management. You do not have the right to go through the desk in my house." "It is not your house," Eleanor said. "Your father is dead." She heard her own breathing. She was surprised by how steady it was. She asked again about the life insurance policy. Clarence stood up. He was not a fast man, but he was substantial, and the way he crossed the room toward her was not a lunge but something more deliberate. He took hold of the collar of her wool coat with one hand. "Your father died drowning in debt," he said very quietly. "There is nothing in this house that belongs to you. You are old enough to work. You have been old enough since spring." He let go of her collar and walked to the rear door of the house, the one that opened toward the back property where his horse stood saddled and waiting. He opened the door. The cold came in like a wall. Eleanor went to her bedroom and took what she could reach quickly. A heavy wool blanket, her father's canvas work coat so large on her that the cuffs came past her knuckles. A folding knife with a staghorn handle that Thomas had kept on his belt every day she could remember. A box of waterproof matches. 2 pairs of heavy wool socks. She reached for the small, framed photograph on the shelf above the bed, the one taken in Millhaven 4 years ago, showing herself and her father standing in front of the assay office, both of them squinting into the sun. "Now," Clarence said from the doorway. She came out through the rear of the house into the cold and dark. The door closed behind her. Not slammed, just closed with a finality that was somehow worse for its quietness. She stood in the frozen yard and reached into the pocket of her denim trousers. Her fingers found a folded paper. $2.50 in silver coin and a worn single-dollar bill, her last month's earnings from mending harnesses for the Holbrook family down the valley. $4.50 and some change. Everything she had in the world. She picked up the canvas bag she had dropped in the snow and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then she felt something else. There was an object inside the bag that she had not packed. She reached into the top of the bag, and her fingers closed around the familiar weight of her father's brass compass, wrapped carefully in a strip of oilcloth. Tucked into the folds of the oilcloth was a small square of paper. She angled it toward the light coming from the kitchen window and read the words written there in Clarence's flat, deliberate handwriting. "Do not come back." She stood with that piece of paper for a long moment, looking at the compass, looking at the horse by the rear gate. Clarence had saddled his horse this morning. He had packed her bag sometime today while she was out. He had put her father's compass inside it and written that note and waited for evening. This was not a decision made in anger or in drink. This was something that had been arranged. He wanted her to go east, into the Blackwood timber, far from the road, far from Millhaven, far from anyone who might see her and ask questions. The nearest town was Millhaven, 6 miles down the mountain. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon, and the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office, where Denton Crow, who had signed the petition to take her father's land, kept his desk. Eleanor put her father's compass in the left breast pocket of his canvas coat, directly over her heart. She adjusted the bag on her shoulders, then she started walking. She did not go toward Millhaven directly. She went east along the tree line, first staying out of the open where the snow reflected enough moonlight to make a moving figure visible from the house, and she walked for an hour through the timber before she turned south toward the edge of town. The cold worked on her steadily, and she let it, keeping her pace up, watching the ground for ice beneath the snow. Millhaven at 8:30 in the evening was mostly dark. The saloon on the main street showed yellow light and occasional noise. The rest of the town was shuttered against the cold. Eleanor came in along the alley behind the feedlot and stopped at the back door of Finch & Sons General Merchandise. Ezra Finch was putting out his lamp when she knocked. She heard his shuffling step, heard the bolt draw back, and then she was looking up at a man she had known all her life. He was 68 years old, built like a fence post with white hair and a face deeply creased by decades of mountain weather. He had known Thomas Hartwell for 20 years. He had attended the funeral in March, one of only 11 people who came. He looked at her face. He did not ask what had happened. He stepped back from the door to let her in. Silas Finch came out of the back storeroom a moment later. He was 18, dark-haired like his father had been before the gray, with the kind of practical intelligence that made him useful and the kind of caution that made him careful about whose trouble he stepped into. He looked at Eleanor, and she watched him understand the situation in about 4 seconds. "Father," he said, and his voice was quiet and genuinely troubled, not unkind. "Crow was asking about her last week. He said to report any contact with the Hartwell girl if she left the property under her guardianship. If we keep her here, if anyone sees the light and talks, he can pull the store license." "Go check the horses," Ezra said. "Father." "Silas?" The silence between them lasted long enough to be real. Silas looked at Eleanor again. Something moved across his face that she could not entirely read. Then he turned and walked through the storeroom toward the rear exit, and the back door of the shop opened and closed. Ezra moved to the clearance bins at the back of the store without another word. He was a man who communicated more through what he did than what he said, and Eleanor understood that about him the way she had understood it about her father. She spent $1.20 on a military surplus entrenching tool, a folding shovel with a steel blade that could be set at a right angle for pick work left over from an old Army contract lot. She spent 80 cents on a piece of oilcloth tarpaulin with a small tear near one corner reduced from its original price. She spent 50 cents on a box of fire-starting bricks made from pine pitch and compressed sawdust. Total of $2.50. Ezra rang it up without comment. Then without a word, he pushed across the counter a coil of jute rope and a cloth-wrapped package of dried beef. She reached for her coins and he shook his head once. She was turning toward the door when he spoke. "Thomas came in here 3 weeks before he died." She stopped. Ezra was looking at the counter, not at her. He had the deliberate stillness of a man choosing his words the way a carpenter chooses a joint for fit and strength. "He gave me something to keep. He was particular about it. Said if anything happened to him, I was to give it to you and no one else, and only when the time was right." He paused. "I wasn't sure when the right time was. But looking at you now, standing here with a pack on your back and $4 in your pocket, I think I've been waiting long enough." He reached beneath the counter and produced a small envelope of tan leather sealed at the flap with a dot of dark red wax. He held it out to her. She took it. It was light, almost nothing, but she could feel the stiffness of paper inside. "Don't open it here," Ezra said. "Get into the timber first." She nodded. She put the envelope inside the canvas coat against her chest. "Ellie," he said, which was what her father had called her, what almost no one else called her. She looked at him. "Don't trust Crow." She walked out the back door of Finch & Sons into the dark and the cold and turned her face toward the Blackwood Ridge. The 2 miles into the eastern ravine took more than an hour. The terrain dropped sharply once she was past the tree line's edge, the ground broken by exposed rock and the roots of old-growth timber, the snow crust alternating between solid enough to walk on and soft enough to swallow her leg to the knee without warning. She moved carefully, using the compass to hold her bearing, stopping every 100 yards to listen. She found what she was looking for under the roots of a massive western red cedar, a tree so old its root system had created a series of natural chambers in the ground, some of them 2 feet deep and large enough to shelter in. The tree's canopy spread 30 feet in every direction, and the ground beneath it was relatively dry, sheltered from the direct fall of snow. Eleanor laid the oilcloth tarp on the earthbark side up to resist moisture and sat with her back against one of the great root arches. She pulled the canvas coat around her and the wool blanket over the coat and made herself small. She thought about doing the isometric exercises her father had taught her, the muscle contractions that generated heat without movement, and she did them for a while and then she just sat. The temperature dropped through the night. She knew it without needing a thermometer. She could feel it in the quality of the air, the way the cold became dense and heavy rather than merely present. She did not sleep. She marked the hours by the slow movement of the stars visible through gaps in the cedar canopy, and she stayed awake by thinking about things that required concentration, the layout of the property, the wording of the petition, the weight of the brass compass in her pocket. When the sky began to lighten, moving through black to a deep bruised purple, to the first thin gray of dawn, she reached inside her coat and took out the leather envelope. The wax seal broke cleanly under her thumbnail. Inside was a single piece of paper folded twice. It was the kind of paper her father used for field notes, a heavy stock with a faint grid printed on it, and it was covered on one side with his handwriting. Small, precise, the letters of a man who had spent years recording measurements in difficult conditions. It was a map, not a map in the conventional sense. No roads marked, no named features, no scale legend. It was a sketch in the language of surveying using the symbols and notations that Thomas had spent years teaching her. A series of bearing lines radiating from a point that she recognized immediately as the root system of this very cedar. A slope indication, two elevation markers, and at the end of the longest bearing line, northeast by east, a small rectangle with cross-hatching that in surveyor's notation indicated a structure or significant feature below grade. Below grade, underground. In her father's hand, at the bottom of the page was a single sentence. Old mine, northeast of the Big Cedar. Do not trust Crow. Find Agent Reeves at Clearwater Junction if I don't come home. Eleanor sat with that paper for a long time. The morning light came up slow and cold and clear through the cedar boughs. She could hear the first birds beginning somewhere distant and the creak of frozen timber contracting in the early air. She sat with her father's last message in her hands, and she let the weight of it settle into her. Thomas Hartwell had known something was wrong. He had prepared for the possibility that he would not come home from it. He had put the evidence of his preparation into the hands of an old friend and trusted that friend to know when to deliver it. He had thought about his daughter in the middle of whatever it was he was walking toward, and the thing he had thought to do for her was this, a map, bearing a name and a warning. Across the ravine, 3/4 of a mile northeast through the timber, something was buried in the mountain. And whatever it was, two men had already decided it was worth killing for. Eleanor folded the map carefully and pressed it back into the leather envelope and put the envelope against her chest inside the canvas coat. She pulled herself upright against the cedar root, worked the stiffness out of her limbs, and stood in the early gray morning on the mountain her father had loved. She looked northeast. She looked at the compass in her hand. She looked back once at the direction of the cabin, at the smoke that would be rising from Clarence's morning fire. Then she set the needle, picked her bearing, and walked into the timber. The firewood was warm, not dry, not merely preserved. Warm the way a stone feels after sitting in afternoon sun, the way a hand feels when pressed against a living chest. Eleanor had stacked the wood against the rear wall of the dugout 3 days ago, and she pulled a log from the bottom of the pile now, with the expectation of cold dead weight, and what she felt instead stopped her completely. She held the log in both hands in the darkness of the shelter and did not move for a long moment. The temperature outside that morning was somewhere below zero. She knew this without measurement, knew it from the quality of the silence, the way the timber had stopped creaking overnight and gone absolutely still, in the way it only did when the cold reached a certain depth. The moisture in the soil of her dugout walls should have been weeping with condensation. The wood should have been cold enough to sting bare skin. She set the log down and pressed her palm flat against the rear earthen wall. The wall was warm, not the ordinary subsurface warmth her father had described when he taught her about building into hillsides, the steady passive temperature of deep earth that never changes much regardless of season. This was something else. This was active. This was heat coming from a source pushing steadily through several feet of packed clay and glacial silt, as if something on the other side was generating it continuously. Eleanor picked up her folding shovel and tapped the handle end against the wall. She was listening for the resonance of solid earth. What she heard instead was a dull metallic ring that carried no resonance at all. She stood in the darkness of the shelter she had dug with her own blistered hands and understood that the wall of her shelter was not backed by earth. It was backed by something hollow, something made of iron. She lit the stub of a tallow candle she had found in her pack and began to dig with her hands. The earth behind the log pile gave way with almost no resistance. It was dry, almost powdery, and it fell away in soft cascades as her fingers worked through it, so different from the cold, damp clay she had excavated for 3 days to build this shelter that it might have been a different substance entirely. She worked methodically the way her father had taught her to approach any problem underground, clear from the top. Let gravity help, never force what patience can accomplish. It took her less than 10 minutes to expose the door. It was a bulkhead of heavy riveted iron, the kind used in deep mine construction, through the 1860s and into the early 1870s before the big Eastern companies brought in their fabricated steel. The frame was set into the native rock of the hillside with poured mortar that had cracked with age. The wheel handle in the center was thick cast iron coated in decades of rust, and it radiated heat along its entire surface, the way a stovepipe radiates heat after a fire has been burning for an hour. Eleanor took hold of the wheel with both hands. She set her boots against the earthen wall of the shelter on either side of the doorframe and pulled. The wheel held fast. She shifted her weight, finding the angle where her legs could drive the momentum rather than just her arms, and pulled again. Rust scaled off in flat orange flakes. She could feel the mechanism inside resisting the corrosion of years, acting like a weld. She tried a third time using a sound she had not made since the night she was thrown out of her own house, a low, guttural expression of concentrated force that had nothing theatrical about it. The wheel moved, not freely, not smoothly, but it moved half a turn, a full turn, another, and then the locking mechanism disengaged with a clunk she felt through her palms more than heard. She pulled the door open. The air that came out hit her face like stepping into a blacksmith shop in midsummer. Dry, heated, carrying a complex smell, she needed a moment to identify the sharp mineral bite of heated rock, the fatty char of a coal or wood fire burning at high temperature, and beneath both of those faint but unmistakable, the waxy chemical scent of rendered ore. She had smelled that last one twice in her life, both times at the assay office in Millhaven when she had accompanied her father. It was the smell of smelting. Beyond the door was a corrugated steel access tunnel, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, sloping downward at a gentle grade. The temperature inside was extraordinary. Eleanor left her father's canvas coat in the shelter and squeezed through the circular hatch in her flannel shirt and denim trousers. The metal of the tunnel was warm against her hands as she descended. The tunnel opened without warning into a space so large that her candle made almost no impression on it. She stopped at the edge of the opening and raised the candle and turned slowly, trying to understand what she was seeing. The cavern was a worked space, not natural, carved out of the native rock of the mountain and shored up with heavy timber framing in the manner of the deep-lode copper mines that had operated in the Blackwood Range during the 1860s. She could see the original pick marks in the stone walls where the initial excavation had gone. But the original mine had been fitted with something she was not prepared for. Along the north wall of the cavern stood 3 cast-iron smelting furnaces, each one the size of a freight wagon, standing on end, their firebox glowing a deep arterial red through their draft vents. The heat they put out was tremendous, and Eleanor could feel it pressing against her skin from 30 feet away. From each furnace ran a network of iron piping that connected to a long, stone-lined trough running the length of the cavern floor, and the trough held a liquid she recognized from the assay office as a mercury amalgam used to capture gold particles from crushed ore. Stacked against the south wall were wooden crates, dozens of them, each stenciled with a location in the same neat black lettering, Elko County, Nevada. Batch 7 of 12. The ore in those crates had not come from Idaho. Someone had built an illegal gold smelting operation inside the sealed Blackwood copper mine, and they had powered it by rerouting an underground thermal spring, a geothermal feature that ran beneath the eastern ridge, diverting its heat and hydraulic pressure to drive the bellows and maintain the furnace temperatures. The warmth that had been seeping through Eleanor's shelter wall for 3 weeks, the warmth that had kept her firewood dry and her dugout survivable, came from 3 furnaces burning stolen ore 100 feet below the forest floor. Eleanor descended the iron stairs to the cavern floor. She moved along the south wall, staying close to the crated ore, keeping her candle low. Near the far end of the cavern, past the third furnace, a makeshift office had been set up on the flat bedrock floor, a folding table, two camp chairs, a locked iron strongbox, and an oil lantern mounted on a spike driven into the wall. The lantern was lit. Someone had been here recently. Papers were spread across the table. She read without touching them verse, assay, reports purchase, orders for smelting supplies, a letter of credit from a bank in San Francisco. The names on the documents were not names she recognized, but the signatures appeared consistent, a single person operating under multiple false identities. And then she saw the notebook. It was under the corner of a heavy glass ashtray filled with the cold stubs of hand-rolled cigars. A small book bound in dark brown calfskin leather, the corners worn soft with handling, the spine repaired with a strip of electrical tape that still held. Eleanor had seen that book every day of her life. She had watched her father write in it at the kitchen table on winter evenings, recording his survey measurements, his weather observations, his mechanical notes on the property. She had watched him slip it into his breast pocket each morning before going out. Her hands were not quite steady when she moved the ashtray aside and picked it up. The book fell open to a page near the end, as if it had been read there recently, and the spine remembered the place. She held the candle close and read. October 12th. Found a diverted water line on the eastern slope, heavy pipe professional installation. Someone has rerouted the Blackwood thermal spring from its natural outlet. The heat signature on the surface above the old copper workings is considerable. I believe the mine has been reopened. October 15th, I am certain now. I followed the pipe to the old north adit. Clarence's horse was tied outside. He has been using the mine to smelt ore. The ore is coming from Nevada, not from this property. He is using my land as a processing station, my thermal spring as his energy source. This is how he has been settling his gambling accounts in Denver. October 18th, I confronted him this evening. He was not disturbed. He told me that Sheriff Crow has been compensated and will provide whatever documentation is needed if questions arise. He told me that if I contact the federal land office in Boise, he will swear that I organized and operated the smelting concern myself. He knows I have no witnesses. He knows the county court will defer to Crow. Tomorrow morning, I will ride to the Pinkerton office at Clearwater Junction. There is an agent stationed there named Reeves who has been investigating illegal ore transport in the territory. I have to protect Ellie. The entry for October 19th, 1886 was 3 lines long, and the handwriting was different from everything that had come before it. Not shaky, not rushed, but somehow more deliberate, as if each word had been chosen with the understanding that it might be the last ones he wrote. If something happens before I reach Reeves, the map in the sealed envelope at Ezra's will show anyone who can read my notation where to find all of this. I have tried to leave enough that Ellie will not have to do this alone. I am sorry that I could not do better. The date was October 19th, 1886. Thomas Hartwell had been found dead in the Old North adit on the morning of October 20th, crushed beneath a collapsed support timber that Sheriff Crow had characterized in his incident report as a structural failure consistent with the age and condition of the abandoned mine. Eleanor stood in the red heat of the cavern with her father's notebook in her hands and understood in a way that was not dramatic but simply final, like a door closing, that her father had not been careless. He had not made a mistake. He had gone to the mine that morning to collect additional documentation for the Pinkerton agent, and the men who stood to lose everything if he reached that agent had made certain he did not. Thomas Hartwell had been murdered by his brother on land that Thomas had bought with the work of his own life in a mine that Clarence had converted into an instrument of theft. And when it was done, the county sheriff who owed Clarence his position had closed the case in less than 2 hours. She did not cry. She had done her crying in March, in the 4 weeks after the funeral, when she had still been allowing herself to believe it was an accident. What she felt now was not grief, but something colder and more useful. She felt the specific, focused anger of someone who has been handed a lie and held it in their hands long enough to understand its exact dimensions. She became aware of the heat pressing on her from all sides and realized she had been standing motionless for longer than she knew. She pulled the notebook from under her arm where she had pressed it, opened it to the last few pages, and began to read again more carefully this time, looking at the technical details, the survey notations, the precise descriptions of the piping network, and furnace layout. Her father had documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who understood that documentation was the only weapon available to him. She was still reading when she heard the gate. The sound came from the far end of the cavern, a direction she had not yet investigated, the grinding mechanical roll of a heavy door opening on a counterweighted track. Light spilled in from a tunnel large enough to admit a horse and wagon, a primary entrance that must have opened somewhere on the lower slope of the mountain, well away from her dugout. The light was the gray-white of overcast morning sky. Eleanor moved without thinking. She crossed the cavern floor in a low run, staying behind the ore crates, and reached the folding table in 3 seconds. She went under it and pulled the canvas dust cover down over the front edge until it reached the ground. She pressed herself into the back corner of the space beneath the table, her knees drawn up the notebook held flat against her chest. Boots on rock, 2 sets moving at different paces. The number 2 furnace is running 6 degrees past its rated limit. The voice was tight, professional, carrying the clipped precision of a man who thought in mechanical tolerances. At this rate, the amalgam temperature in the south trough will exceed the separation threshold before the next batch is ready. We will lose yield. Adjust the draft. The second voice was her uncle's. She had not heard Clarence's voice for nearly 3 weeks, and it came to her now as if no time had passed at all. Flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his adult life been required to solve a problem he could not simply hand to someone else. I have adjusted the draft. That is not the issue. The issue is that the thermal line from the spring is running hotter than it did in October, which means the ground temperature has shifted, which means our baseline calculations are no longer accurate, which means, Hector. The footsteps stopped. Fix it, Clarence said. A pause, then the man called Hector spoke again and his voice had changed. The professional precision was still there, but something had been added to it, something lower and less comfortable. The girl's been gone 3 weeks, Hector said. People in Millhaven are starting to ask. Ezra Finch told Deke Holbrook he saw her the night she left. If she's found dead out there, there will be a territorial inquiry. They will search the whole ridge. Clarence's boots moved. She could hear them crossing the cavern floor coming toward the table. Eleanor made herself completely still, working to regulate her breathing until it made no sound. She is a minor who ran away from her legal guardian, Clarence said. Children disappear in the Blackwood every winter. By the time the snow breaks in April, there will not be enough remaining to require an inquiry into anything. Hector did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. Thomas was different. He came to me first. He told me directly what he intended to do. We were out of time and out of options. Another pause. But the girl didn't come to anyone. She doesn't know anything. She may know more than you think. Clarence's boots stopped. He was at the table. She could see the toe of his left boot through a gap at the bottom of the canvas cover 6 inches from her right knee. And it no longer matters either way. The January settlement with the Denver creditors requires the land transfer to be complete and uncontested. For that transfer to be uncontested, she needs to be gone. Not in Millhaven, not in some county home in Boise. Gone. Hector said nothing. The life insurance policy pays out in full upon legal declaration of death, Clarence continued. That declaration requires 6 months from the date of disappearance. She walked into the Blackwood on November 14th. By mid-May, I will hold clear title to the land and the policy payout both. The silence that followed was the kind that comes when one man has said something and another man is deciding whether he will be the kind of person who answers it or the kind who looks away. I don't like it, Hector said at last. You do not have to like it, Clarence said. You have to fix the furnace. The boots moved away from the table. Eleanor heard Hector walk south toward the furnaces without another word. Clarence remained near the table for a moment longer. She felt him lean against the edge of it, felt a slight shift in the structure above her. He was looking at the papers on the table. She heard him move the ashtray. She heard a pause. She pressed herself harder into the corner, the notebook flat against her sternum, willing herself to take up less space than she occupied. She heard him set the ashtray back down. Then his footsteps moved away toward the north wall of the cavern, and she heard the sound of the strongbox being opened with a key. She did not move. She stayed under the table and measured time by the sounds around her. The roar of the furnaces, Hector working somewhere to the south with wrenches and pipe fittings, the occasional movement of Clarence near the strongbox. At some point, Clarence walked back toward the main entrance tunnel. She heard him call something to Hector about the delivery schedule. She heard Hector respond without looking up from his work. Then Clarence's boots crossed to the main entrance, and the sound of a horse moving on gravel came from the tunnel, and then faded and then was gone. Hector worked alone at the furnaces for what felt like a very long time. Eleanor waited. She had learned patience in the 3 weeks of her survival on the ridge, and she used it now, remaining motionless until she heard Hector set down his tools and walk to the main entrance. He stopped there for a while, and she heard the sound of a man eating from a tin, and then the scrape of boots on rock as he went back to the furnaces. And then after another long interval, the sound of footsteps going up the main entrance tunnel and out into the air. She counted 200 slow heartbeats after the last sound of him disappeared. Then she slid out from under the table. The notebook was still in her hands. She looked at the ashtray where it sat on the table corner. She thought about what Clarence had done with his hand when he leaned against the table, the slight movement she had heard. She looked at the table surface more carefully. The papers were still there. The assay reports, the letters of credit, but the ashtray had been moved 6 inches to the left, and there was a clean rectangle in the dust of the table surface where something had been taken away. Something that had been under the ashtray. Something she had read and memorized and pressed against her body and carried with her through every second of hiding. She looked at the notebook in her hands, the dark calfskin cover, the worn edges. Her father's notebook was still here. She had it. Clarence had taken something else from under the ashtray, something she had not noticed in her urgency to read the notebook. She thought back carefully to what she had seen when she first approached the table. The ashtray at the corner, the notebook beneath it. And before she had moved the ashtray, before she had seen the notebook, there had been something else just visible at the edge of the ashtray's shadow. A smaller paper, folded once. She had not read it because the notebook had consumed her entirely. Clarence had taken it. She did not know what it said. She did not know if it changed anything. She held her father's notebook and looked at the dust outline and told herself that what she had was enough, that a dead man's handwriting in his own book describing his own murder by his own brother had to be enough. She went up the access tunnel at a controlled run through the hatch into the dugout and spun the iron wheel to lock the door behind her. She lay on her back in the cold, in the dark of her shelter, with the heat still radiating up through the floor from the mountain below, and held the notebook against her chest and breathed. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it working through the timber at the pampa the ravine. The fire in the mountain went on without her furnaces turning Nevada ore into untraceable gold bars, a dead man's thermal spring converted into an instrument of theft on a dead man's land. She gave herself until dark. Then she packed everything she could carry, tucked the notebook inside her father's coat against her skin, and went out into the night with a bearing she had already set in her mind, southeast toward the widow Colby's farm, because Agnes Colby was the only person within walking distance who had ever known Thomas Hartwell and had not signed her name to the document that was meant to erase him. The farm was an hour and a half through the timber in the dark. Agnes came to the door with a lantern and a shotgun, and she lowered the shotgun when she saw Eleanor's face, and she did not ask any questions. She opened the door and stood back and let the girl come in from the cold. The kitchen was small and very warm. Agnes set the lantern on the table and put a pot on the stove without speaking. Eleanor sat in the chair nearest the fire and began to feel in a deeply unpleasant way exactly how cold she had been for the past 3 weeks. Crow came here, Agnes said, her back to Eleanor as she worked the stove. Last week, he told me you had left your guardian's care illegally, said anyone sheltering you would be in violation of the territorial guardianship statute. She paused. He said it the way men say things when they want you to know the threat is real. I know what he is, Eleanor said. Agnes turned and looked at her. She was a sturdy woman, 55, and weathered with the hands of someone who had been doing hard physical work alone for a long time. Her husband had died in a mine collapse in 1879. She had not left the ridge since. How long do you need? 1 hour, paper and a pencil if you have them. Agnes got the paper. Eleanor opened her father's notebook and began to write. She transcribed everything from the final pages, the dates, the locations, the names, the technical details of the smelting operation, the explicit statement about Clarence and Crow, the reference to the Pinkerton agent at Clearwater Junction. Her father had trained her memory the way some fathers train aim or physical strength as a practical survival skill, and she used it now with a concentration that left no room for anything else. 3 pages of her own handwriting, precise and small, recording a dead man's testimony. Agnes set a bowl of barley soup on the table next to her and said nothing. Eleanor ate without stopping her writing. When she was finished, she folded the 3 pages and tucked them into the breast pocket of her coat alongside the leather envelope from Ezra. Then she looked at the notebook one more time at her father's handwriting on those final pages, and she felt something she had been holding against for hours finally arrive in her chest. Not grief exactly, but the weight of understanding what someone had cost the world by dying before their time. She closed the notebook. Agnes was at the counter with her back turned when she spoke. Thomas came to see me the night before he died. Her voice was careful as if she had been saving these words and was uncertain of their value. He did not stay long. He told me he was going into the mine in the morning to collect one more piece of evidence, and then he was going to Clearwater Junction. She set down the cup she had been holding. He said something else. He said, "Agnes, if something goes wrong, tell Ellie that the answer is not on top of the ground. It is underset." Eleanor looked at her own coat at the notebook pressed beneath it against her chest. She had found the mine by accident, driven there by cold and survival, and the particular inheritance of a father who had taught his daughter to pay attention. But Thomas had known she might need to find it. He had left the map knowing she might have to use it. He had spoken those words to Agnes, knowing there was a chance he would not come home to say them himself. Agnes turned around. She crossed to the table and set down a folded $5 bill. "Clearwater Junction is 15 miles south. Don't use the main road." She looked at Eleanor with the steady regard of a woman who has buried a husband and kept her own counsel for 7 years on a mountain that tried to take everything. "There is a Pinkerton man there. Your father trusted him. That is enough for me." Eleanor took the $5. She stood and pulled on her coat and adjusted the pack on her shoulders. She looked at Agnes and could not find words that were proportionate to what the woman had just given her, so she did not try. She put her hand briefly on Agnes's arm, and Agnes nodded, and Eleanor went out the door into the dark. She had been on the South Bering Trail for less than an hour when she heard the hoofbeats. They came from the main road paralleling her course to the west, moving south at a canter. She stepped off the trail and crouched in the shadow of a spruce, watching the gap between the trees where the road was just visible. The rider came into view for 3 seconds before the timber took him back. He was sitting a dark horse at a working pace, not hurried but purposeful, with the upright posture of a young man who had grown up riding. She recognized the silhouette before she could see the face. Silas Finch. She remained crouched in the shadow and watched the darkness where he had been. He was heading south toward Clearwater Junction at 3 in the morning. He had seen her tracks on the trail, and he had not called out, and he had not stopped. He had continued south on the main road. She thought about what his father had said in the store 2 nights ago. She thought about the way Silas had looked at her when he came out of the storeroom, the unreadable expression before he turned away. She did not know if he was riding to Clearwater Junction to warn the Pinkerton agent about her, or to warn someone else about her, or for some reason she had not yet thought of. What she knew was this: if Silas Finch arrived at Clearwater Junction before she did whatever was waiting, there would already know she was coming. She stood up, adjusted her father's notebook against her chest, set her bearing south by southeast, and began to move faster through the dark timber than she had moved since the night she left her father's house. The cold in the 5th hour was different from the cold in the first. In the first hour, cold had been an opponent, something to push against and outpace. By the 5th hour, it had become something else entirely, not a force outside her body, but a condition within it, as if the temperature had crossed some threshold and was now simply part of what she was made of. Her left foot had stopped hurting somewhere around the 3rd hour. She knew what that meant. Her father had told her exactly what that meant, and she kept moving because stopping was the only thing worse than knowing. She was navigating by the compass and by memory, holding a southeast bearing through timber so dense that the moonlight barely reached the ground. She had left the trail after spotting Silas Finch on the road and was moving through unbroken forest, pushing through snow-laden spruce boughs that dumped their loads across her shoulders and down the back of her neck each time she pressed past them. The notebook was still inside her coat. She could feel it against her sternum, not warm but present, which was enough. She had been in motion for nearly 6 hours when she heard the gunshot. It came from the southwest, a single flat crack that the timber compressed into something shorter and duller than the open-air sound of a rifle. She stopped and stood completely still. 30 seconds later, a second shot. Same direction, slightly closer. Not a hunter. Not at this hour, not in this cold. A signal pattern. Someone was in the forest between her and Clearwater Junction. She turned the compass slowly in her palm, working through the geometry. If the shots came from the southwest and she was moving southeast, then whoever was firing was positioned to her right and ahead of her, cutting across the angle of her approach. Not following. Intersecting. Hector Malone had heard Clarence's conversation about the life insurance policy and the May deadline and had said only that he did not like it. That was not the same as refusing. A man who helped stage a mining accident and said afterward that he did not like it was still a man who had helped stage a mining accident. She changed her bearings, pushing east for nearly half a mile before turning south again, adding distance she could not afford but could not avoid. The new route took her across a frozen creek bed where the ice was thin enough to flex under her weight without breaking, and she crossed it quickly with her arms out for balance and did not look down. The lights of Clearwater Junction appeared below her through the trees at 5:45 in the morning. Not many lights, a handful of gas lamps marking the main street, the yellow rectangle of the train depot window, and one other, a single lamp burning in the small frame building beside the depot that bore a painted sign she could read from the tree line. Pinkerton National Detective Agency, W Territory Division. She came down the last slope on legs that were operating on something beyond normal physical function, something she did not have a name for but recognized as the body's last reserves being drawn against a debt that would come due later. The snow on the open ground between the tree line and the building was knee-deep and unbroken. She went through it without grace, without strategy, simply forward. She pushed open the door of the Pinkerton office. The heat of the room struck her so suddenly that her vision went briefly white at the edges. She put one hand on the doorframe and held herself upright. The man behind the desk came to his feet fast for someone his age. He was in his early 40s, broad through the chest with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the kind of face that had been weathered by years outdoors into something angular and permanent. He wore no jacket, just a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside a spread of papers. He looked at her the way men look at things that require immediate assessment rather than reaction. She said, "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. My uncle murdered my father to protect an illegal gold smelting operation in the sealed Blackwood copper mine. Sheriff Crow helped him cover it. I have documentation." The man did not speak. He pulled his chair around from behind the desk and set it in front of her without being asked because she was swaying slightly and he had noticed. She did not sit. She opened her coat and produced the items one at a time, the 3 pages of transcribed journal entries in her own handwriting, the leather envelope from Ezra containing Thomas's survey map with the mine's precise coordinates, and the calfskin notebook itself, her father's actual handwriting on the actual pages, the dates and the names, and the final entry written the morning before he died. She set all 3 on the desk. "Marcus Reeves," the man said. "I am the territorial agent for this district." He sat on the edge of the desk rather than behind it, which she understood as a deliberate choice to be at eye level with her. He picked up the transcribed pages first. He read without expression. Not the expression of a man performing neutrality, but the genuine stillness of someone whose mind was working hard enough that his face had simply been set aside. He read the transcription once through, set it down, and picked up the notebook. He found the final entries without difficulty, as if he had known roughly where to look. He read for 4 minutes. Eleanor stood and let the room's warmth begin to work on her hands, which were returning to sensation in a way that was deeply unpleasant. Reeves set the notebook down and looked at the survey map. He studied it for less than a minute. Then he looked at Eleanor with an expression that had something in it she had not expected. Not surprise, not skepticism, but a kind of recognition, as if several things he had been holding separately had just been shown to belong together. "I have been investigating irregular ore shipments through this territory for 4 months," he said. "Heavy freight moving north out of Elko County without proper documentation disappearing somewhere in the Idaho highlands. I could not establish a terminus." He looked at the map again. "Your father found my terminus." He stood and moved to the wall where a large territorial map was pinned, and he found the location on it and pressed his thumb there and held it for a moment. The door opened. Eleanor turned. Silas Finch stepped into the room with snow on his shoulders, and his hands raised to chest height, palms forward, and he said, "I am not here for Clarence," before anyone could speak. Eleanor had the folding knife out of her pocket before she fully decided to reach for it. Old reflex, new world. She held it at her side and looked at him across the small room. My father told me everything after you left, Silas said. He was looking at her, not at Reeves. About Thomas, about what Crow did with the petition, about what your father believed happened in that mine. He reached into his coat with 2 fingers and produced a folded document. This is a sworn statement from my father and 3 other men in Millhaven who saw Clarence Hartwell's horse tied at the north adit of the Blackwood mine on at least 6 separate occasions over the past year. He set it on the desk without approaching Eleanor. Then he reached into his other pocket and placed beside it a piece of cast iron roughly 3 inches across stamped with the foundry number. This is a fragment of a mine support bracket. I found it on the trail outside the north adit the week after Thomas Hartwell's funeral. It has a cut mark on the inner edge, not a break, a cut. Reeves crossed to the desk and picked up the bracket without touching the document. He turned it in his hands and examined the inner edge under the lamplight. Eleanor was still looking at Silas. You could have taken my trail to Crow, she said. You saw my tracks on the south path. Yes, he said, but you didn't. No. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not going to pretend I was never afraid of Crow because I was. My father has built that store for 30 years, and Crow has made certain we knew he could take it. But there is a difference between being afraid of a man and doing his work for him. He paused. I stopped being willing to be afraid of Denton Crow at about 3 this morning, when I understood what he had let happen to Thomas. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she put the knife away. Reeves was already at the telegraph key on the side table. I need both of you to sit down and stay in this room, he said, not looking up from the instrument. I am sending to the federal prosecutor's office in Denver and to the territorial marshal in Boise. What you have brought me tonight is sufficient for federal warrants. What Finch has brought changes the charge on the mine collapse from accidental death to homicide. The key began to click. This is going to move quickly. The door opened a second time. Hector Malone walked in without knocking. He was alone. He was not carrying a visible weapon, which Eleanor noted immediately. He was a compact man in his late 30s with the particular posture of someone who has spent years working in low-ceiling spaces slightly forward, through the shoulders, head carried a little down. His face was expressionless in the way of a man who has arrived at a decision and is now simply executing it. Silas stepped sideways to put himself between Hector and Eleanor. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the wall beside the door. Hector looked at Eleanor and said, Clarence sent me to find you and take back whatever you carried out of the mine. He reached into his coat with his right hand. Silas's hand closed on the rifle stock. Reeves stopped telegraphing and turned in his chair. Hector produced Thomas Hartwell's notebook. Not the one Eleanor was carrying. The original. The one that had been under the ashtray that first night. The one she had pressed against her chest for hours. The one Clarence had apparently taken from the table and given to Hector to use as leverage. Hector set it on the floor at his feet and stepped back from it. I followed her tracks from the Colby farm, he said, still addressing Eleanor. I have been behind her for 4 hours. I had 3 opportunities to stop her before she reached this building, and I did not take any of them. He looked at Reeves now. Thomas Hartwell spoke to me before he went to the mine that last morning. He told me he was going to document the furnace installation and then ride to Clearwater Junction. He asked me not to say anything to Clarence until he had spoken with the Pinkerton agent. Hector's voice was level and careful with the rhythm of a man delivering a prepared statement. I told Clarence within an hour. I told myself it was because I had no choice. I have spent 6 weeks understanding that I did have a choice and that I made the wrong one. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the depot clock audible through the wall. Reeves said, You understand that voluntary testimony in a federal homicide investigation does not exempt you from prosecution as an accessory. Yes, Hector said, and you are prepared to give that testimony. Yes. Reeves looked at Hector for a moment with the assessing stillness Eleanor had already seen him use. Then he picked up the notebook from the floor himself, set it beside the copy on the desk, and returned to the telegraph key. Sit down, he said. All of you. Eleanor sat, for the first time in 6 weeks, in a chair in a warm room with a notebook on the desk and the bracket fragment beside it, and 4 pages of evidence that could not be undone. She let herself stop moving. The exhaustion arrived all at once, the way a wave arrives, not gradually, but as a total thing, and she breathed through it and stayed upright because she was not finished yet. Reeves worked the telegraph for 20 minutes. At some point, someone pressed a tin cup of coffee into Eleanor's hands, and she drank it without tasting it. Outside, through the single window of the office, the sky above the mountain was beginning to change, the deep black softening to a dark blue, the Blackwood Ridge taking shape against it as a darker mass, the place where she had spent 6 weeks learning what her father had left her and what had been taken from him. Reeves said, "The territorial marshal is coming on the morning train from Boise. 2 federal men are already in the territory and will arrive by midday. I will ride to the Hartwell property with what agents I have here at first light." He looked at Eleanor. "I need you to tell me the exact location of the mine entrance your father marked on that survey." She described it from memory. The bearing from the large cedar, the depth of the north adit entrance below the surface grade, the location of the secondary hatch. She had used the layout of the cavern and the furnace positions, and the ore crates stacked against the south wall. She spoke for 12 minutes without notes and did not repeat herself once. Reeves wrote it all down. When she finished, he looked at what he had written and then at her. "Your father trained you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Good man," Reeves said quietly and returned to his preparations. They rode out at first light, Reeves and 2 agents from the junction office with Eleanor in the second wagon and Silas Finch riding alongside on the road north to Millhaven. Hector Malone was kept in the junction office under the watch of a 3rd agent, not under arrest, not yet free, occupying the difficult space between those 2 conditions that his own choices had created for him. The road up the mountain was iced from the night's drop in temperature, and the horses moved carefully. Eleanor sat in the wagon bed wrapped in a blanket someone had found for her and watched the Blackwood Ridge come into full morning light for the first time in weeks from a position below it rather than inside it. The mountain looked the same as it always had, indifferent and enormous, keeping its own counsel. 2 federal marshals from Boise had been telegraphed during the night and had ridden hard, arriving at the Millhaven Junction just as Reeves's party was passing through. The sheriff's office was their first stop. Eleanor stayed in the wagon and watched through the frost-cleared circle she made on the side panel as the 2 marshals went into the building and came out 4 minutes later with Denton Crow between them. Crow was in his uniform. He had clearly been at his desk, which told her something about the kind of man he was, the kind who kept to his routines because routines were the thing that made the lie feel true. He came out of the building into the main street of Millhaven, and he looked at the wagon, and he looked at Eleanor, and he looked away, which told her the rest of what she needed to know about him. Ezra Finch was opening the front door of his store when the party passed. He stood on his step with his hand still on the door handle and watched Crow being walked down the street in front of his own building. He did not move. He did not speak. He watched until the marshals put Crow in a transport wagon, and then he looked at Eleanor in the Pinkerton wagon, and he nodded once, a small, precise motion, and went back inside. The tactical approach to the Hartwell property took another hour to set up properly. Reeves was deliberate about it in a way that Eleanor recognized as professional competence rather than caution. He wanted the main entrance to the mine sealed from the outside before anyone entered the property to prevent Clarence from retreating into the mountain if he was warned by the sound of horses. 2 agents went ahead on foot through the eastern timber to locate and secure the north adit while the main party came up the road. Eleanor's wagon stopped at the foot of the driveway. She had not been back to this property since November 14th. She looked at the familiar line of fence posts along the drive, the snow-weighted boughs of the spruce her father had planted the year she was born, the stone chimney of the cabin above the roofline. Smoke was rising from it. Clarence was home. She watched Reeves and 3 agents go up the drive on foot, moving in the spread pattern of men who have done this before. She watched them reach the porch. She watched the cabin door open and Reeves speak, and then a 2nd agent moved to the side of the door, and then Clarence Hartwell came out onto the porch of the house his brother had built. He was in his shirt and vest, no coat, as if he had been startled from an indoor task. His face had the particular pallor of a man whose body understands what his mind has not yet accepted. He looked at the agents on his porch. He looked at the wagon at the end of the driveway. Eleanor reached over and lowered the wagon's side panel and sat where he could see her clearly. Clarence looked at her across the distance of the driveway, across the snow-covered ground of the property where Thomas Hartwell had planted fence posts and cut timber and built a life, and Eleanor looked back at him. She did not feel what she had imagined she would feel in this moment during the long nights in the dugout shelter when she had let herself think ahead to it. There was no triumph. There was no satisfaction in the theatrical sense. What there was something simpler and more durable, the specific relief of a weight being lifted that you have carried for so long, you had stopped noticing how much it cost you to carry it. She did not say anything. She simply looked at him until the agents put his hands behind his back, and she kept looking until the transport wagon door closed between them, and then she looked at the cabin and the chimney smoke and the mountain behind it. The federal investigation took 11 weeks. Eleanor spent most of them in a boarding house in Boise that the Pinkerton agency arranged, giving testimony, reviewing documents, answering the questions of 3 different attorneys and 2 federal investigators with the same methodical accuracy her father had built into her over 16 years of deliberate instruction. Hector Malone testified for 3 days before the federal grand jury. He described the construction of the smelting operation, the rerouting of the thermal spring, the arrangement with the Nevada ore brokers, and the events of October 19th and 20th, 1886 in precise detail. He described how Clarence had told him that morning that Thomas had to be stopped before he reached Clearwater Junction. He described what he had done and what he had not done, and he did not attempt to minimize either. The prosecutor asked him once why he had ultimately chosen to surrender himself rather than flee. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because Thomas Hartwell asked me not to say anything, and I said yes, and then I did the opposite. I owe him a debt I cannot pay. This is the closest I can get." Clarence Hartwell was convicted on 4 federal counts: conspiracy to commit murder, operating an illegal smelting concern on federal territorial land theft of a natural water resource designated as a public utility under territorial law, and filing fraudulent guardianship documents with the territorial court. The sentence was life imprisonment at the Idaho Federal Penitentiary. The judge noted in his written decision that the premeditated nature of the guardianship petition filed weeks before Thomas Hartwell's death demonstrated a level of calculation that precluded any possibility of leniency. Sheriff Denton Crowe received 15 years on charges of corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to homicide after the fact. He served his sentence at the same penitentiary as Clarence and died there in 1901 without having spoken publicly about any of it. Hector Malone received 7 years reduced from the original charge of accessory to murder in the first degree in recognition of his voluntary testimony and surrender. He served his sentence at the territorial prison in Boise and was released in 1894. He left Idaho and was not heard from in the Blackwood area again. The federal investigation produced one finding that Eleanor had not anticipated. Agent Reeves came to the boarding house in Boise on a Wednesday afternoon in February with a folder of papers and a particular expression she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when something complicated had resolved into something simple. He sat across the table from her and told her what the investigation had determined about the provenance of the ore being processed in the mine. Every ounce of it had come from Nevada, not from Idaho, not from the Hartwell property. Clarence had used the land as a location, the thermal spring as a power source, and the old mine as a processing facility, but he had brought his raw material from outside the territory entirely purchased through 3 intermediary brokers using assumed names. The Hartwell land had never been mined. The timber had been cut selectively and responsibly over the years by Thomas, who believed in managing a working forest rather than stripping it. The streams ran clean. The soil had not been disturbed by any extraction activity. "Your father's land," Reeves said, "is exactly what your father believed it was. 400 acres of old-growth timber, 3 seasonal streams, a geothermal feature of significant value and clean title, going back to the original territorial purchase of 1879. Eleanor looked at the folder on the table. "And the title? Restored to your name as of last week by order of the Federal District Court." He slid the folder across. "The fraudulent guardianship petition was voided at the time of Clarence's arrest. The court has granted you legal emancipation on the grounds that no surviving adult guardian exists, and that you have demonstrated with some emphasis by the presiding judge a capacity for independent judgment that exceeds what the law typically requires of someone your age." She opened the folder. The deed to the Hartwell property was on top, her name on it, in the neat official script of the court clerk. Underneath it was the voided guardianship petition stamped in red. Underneath that was a letter from the Fidelity and Merchants Life Assurance Company of Chicago, confirming that the life insurance policy on Thomas Hartwell, payable to Eleanor Hartwell, as named beneficiary, would be remitted upon her formal request. She closed the folder. Reeves was watching her with the same quality of attention he had given her on the first morning the assessment that was not cold but simply precise. "What will you do?" he asked. "Go home," she said. The spring thaw came late to the Blackwood Ridge that year, the snowpack holding through March and into early April before the warming broke it loose. Eleanor came back to the mountain on a Tuesday in the second week of April, arriving by wagon from Millhaven, with Ezra Finch driving and Silas riding alongside on the same dark horse she had watched him ride south on a February night that felt longer ago than it was. Agnes Colby was on her porch when the wagon passed the farm. She raised one hand in greeting and did not come down, which was the right instinct. Some homecomings need space. The cabin was exactly as Eleanor had left it on the morning of November 14th. The federal agents who had processed the property had done so without much disturbance to the interior, and whoever had padlocked the door after Clarence's arrest had been careful about it. She unlocked the padlock herself with the key that Reeves had sent with her in Boise. The door swung open. The interior was cold and smelled of disuse, the particular still air of a space that has been waiting. Her father's chair was still by the fireplace. She built a fire in the fireplace, the first fire in the house since November, using wood from the stack on the porch that she and Thomas had cut together the previous August. She made coffee on the cook stove and carried it to the front porch and drank it standing, looking out over the valley that fell away below the property to the south, the timber running in long, dark ridges to the horizon. Ezra came up from where he had tied the wagon and stood beside her without being asked. He drank his own coffee and looked at the same view. After a while, he said, "Thomas used to say this was the best piece of ground in the territory." "He was right," Eleanor said. Silas stayed by the horses, giving them the distance. He had been doing that since Boise, finding the right amount of space, which was a form of respect she had come to appreciate. Agnes came in the late afternoon with a covered dish and sat at the kitchen table while Eleanor relearned the rhythms of the house, which drawer the kitchen knives lived in, which floorboard creaked in the hallway, which window latch needed lifting while turning to work properly. All of it was still there, stored in some part of her that the winter had not reached. Agnes said, before she left, "He would be proud of you." Eleanor looked at the table where her father used to write his survey notes in the evenings. "I know," she said, not arrogantly, simply as a fact she had earned the right to know. The following morning, she walked east into the ravine for the first time since February. The trail down was familiar in the way that only the places of childhood are familiar, known not just by memory, but by the body itself, the feet finding the right footing without instruction. The snow was gone from the lower slopes, the ground soft with melt, the first pale shoots of early grass showing in the open spaces between the trees. The great western red cedar was unchanged. She had expected it to be, but she was still glad of it, the massive permanence of a tree that had stood here for longer than anyone could determine its root system, creating the same chambers in the earth that had sheltered her on the first night. The dugout was still there. The iron bulkhead door had been welded shut by the federal engineers who had decommissioned the smelting operation, the seal marked with a territorial survey stake. But the small excavation she had dug the chamber carved into the hillside with a $5 surplus shovel, and her own blistered hands remained as she had left it. She unslung the canvas pack from her shoulder and took out the entrenching tool. She held it for a moment, the folding shovel with its worn wooden handle, and the small rust spot on the blade where the finish had chipped. $1.20 at a clearance bin in Millhaven, bought on the worst night of her life with money she could not afford to spend. She had carried it into the mine and out of it. She had carried it to Clearwater Junction and back. She had carried it all the way to Boise and back again without quite being able to put it down. She crouched at the entrance of the dugout and set the shovel inside, laying it carefully against the earthen wall where it rested at a slight angle, its blade catching a slant of morning light from the entrance. She stayed crouched there for a moment looking at it. Her father had told her once, kneeling in the garden behind the cabin, to show her how to read the layers of soil, that the earth remembered everything that had happened in it. He meant it as a practical observation about stratigraphy and ground composition, the way a good surveyor could read the history of a landscape from what the ground held. But she thought about it differently now. She thought about what this particular piece of ground held: a door that had kept a secret, a tunnel that had carried stolen heat upward through 60 feet of mountain, And above all of it on the surface, a small excavated chamber where a 16-year-old girl had kept herself alive through 43 nights of an Idaho winter on $4 and a folding shovel and the things her father had taught her. The mountain had tried to hold all of that in silence. It had very nearly succeeded. She stood and looked once more at the shovel, at the thin line of light crossing its blade, and then she turned and walked back up out of the ravine toward the cabin and the smoke rising from its chimney and the 400 acres of old-growth timber that belonged to her. Now that had always belonged to her that no one was ever going to take again. The brass compass was in her left breast pocket directly over her heart, exactly where she had been keeping it since the night this began. She did not take it out. She did not need to check her heading. She knew exactly where she was going.